Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy, we are reading the chapter on materialism here. He says that the great basic question of all philosophy is that concerning the relation of thinking and being. Okay, this is the great debate of philosophy. What is the relationship between being, existing, and thinking? In the old times, he says, from the very early times when men, still completely ignorant of the structure of their own bodies, under the stimulus of dream apparitions, came to believe that their thinking and sensation were not activities of their bodies, but of a distinct soul which inhabits the body and leaves it at death. So because of dreams, we came to believe that there was a thinking element within us which was not our physical bodies. There was something non-physical within us that did the thinking. And he's saying the main reason we thought that is because of dreams. Because in dreams, people appeared to us who were dead. And people appeared to us that were not there. So we thought that that's their soul speaking to us. And from there, we developed the idea of the soul, he says. And from there, the second step was the view that the soul could live beyond the body. The body died, but the soul existed, since people who were dead were also coming in my dreams. This slowly over time leads to the evolution of religion. You can read this book by Robert Wright if you're more interested. The primitive religions were basically all personifications of natural forces. Gods were the personification of natural forces. Thunder and lightning and fire and water and rain and sky and earth, all of these things were basically gods. Monotheism developed as a process. Out of the many more or less limited and mutually limiting gods, there arose in the minds of men the idea of the one exclusive God of monotheistic religion. So all the powers of these different gods, some that were kings that had been elevated to the level of God, some that were natural forces that we were calling God, some that were just, some force that was roaming around a tree or something that we thought, this tree is whatever. All of that is now said, no. Or if we combine all of the different forces of nature and everything that we see, that is the one God. Did God create the world, or has the world been in existence for eternity, became the main debate of philosophy. Because the philosophers were the ones that believed that the matter had always existed in some form or the other. The matter was eternal. Whereas the other side, scholastics, the religious scholars, etc., believed that God had always existed and he had created matter. And there were obviously attempts to reconcile both, that maybe matter had existed but not in any form, and that God had given matter form, etc., and so on. So there were many attempts to reconcile both, but these were the two major positions. That there was the spiritual element that had been eternal, and that had created the world of matter, or vice versa, that matter was eternal, and from it had arisen the spiritual element, i.e. thinking. So for philosophers, what was primary could be either spirit or matter. For the church, of course, it was spirit. And within the church also there was a big debate. Did God create the world, or has the world been in existence eternally? So these were the two camps. Those who said that primarily there is the spirit were, he refers to as idealists. And the ones who said what exists primarily is matter, and from which develops the spirit, within which develops the spirit. Spirit, in other words, thinking, is nothing other than matter thinking about itself. Those were the materialists. These are the two great camps of philosophers. Theologians and philosophers all are divided into these two major big camps, he says, in history. Okay? Whether spirit is eternal or precedes matter, or whether matter precedes spirit. Here, spirit is not being used in the sense of God. It can be, but not necessarily. Spirit is anything. It is the entity that thinks, the thinking element. The second question of philosophy was the identity of thinking and being, which means that, okay, we are thinking about the world, we're thinking about being. Is our thinking identical with what exists? The identity of thinking and being means whether our thinking is able to accurately reflect about the world that we're thinking about. So he says over here as well, the majority of philosophers said, yes, the human beings have the capacity to be able to objectively grasp the world. Doesn't mean that they've grasped it objectively, but they have the capacity to understand it correctly. whereas there were some scholars who were skeptical about that, said, no, it can't be done, and so on. For Hegel, the world is a gradual realization of the absolute idea, which absolute idea has existed somewhere from eternity, independent of the world and before the world. Okay? So for Hegel, this absolute idea has always existed and will always exist. It's from eternity. It's like God, except it's not like the Christian God. It's like Hegel's own abstraction from the concept of God. So for thought to know itself within the Hegelian system is not hard, or for thought to know itself correctly is not hard. There is no difficulty in the identity of thinking and being, because the thing that's doing the thinking is doing the thinking about the thing doing the thinking. In other words, the thing that's doing the thinking is thinking about itself. So you can think about yourself and grasp yourself objectively. Hume and Kant, on the other hand, were the skeptics. They said, no. It's not necessarily the case that we can objectively understand the world. Hume said the reason is that we cannot grasp causation. Causation doesn't actually exist in the world. The only thing that exists in the world is constant conjunction. Things happen together, I admit that. They have a high probability or a low probability of having together. But the idea of causation is something that we have put on top of things that constantly happen together. They do not necessarily always have to happen together. So if I drop something, it doesn't necessarily always have to fall. The fact that it does is just constant conjunction, not causation. On the other hand was Kant. Kant said you can't know the thing in itself. Okay, why can't you know the thing in itself? Because the thing, you can only know the idea of the thing. You can only grasp what your mind is thinking, and you're grasping that from sensations. And then you have a whole series of categories in your mind, innate categories. Causation is one of them, space and time and relation, etc., that help you make sense of that stimuli, those empirical sensations. So you never are able to fully understand the thing in itself. The only thing you can understand is the idea of the thing in itself. I'll have to put it this way, have you ever heard this? Have you guys ever heard this dialogue? You're not in love with me, you're just in love with the idea of being in love. You've heard it? Okay, I feel sorry for you already. So Kant is like that. I don't know the chair, I know the idea of the chair. Okay? I don't love the chair, I love the idea of loving the chair. Right? Same thing. And we can only interpret that thing from within the categories of thought that are already embedded within us. He thought this was, number one, a synthesis of empiricism and rationalism. And number two, it also left enough space open for free will to continue to exist and for some form of space for religion to continue to exist. So what does Engels think about that? He says, if we are able to prove the correctness of our conception of a natural process by making it ourselves, bringing it into being out of its conditions, and making it serve our own purpose into the bargain, then there is an end to the Kantian ungraspable thing in itself. How do I know that I know the thing in itself? I know that I know the thing in itself because I am able to make the thing not just for itself but for me. I am able to make it do the things that I want it to do. I am able to make it out of the things that are not it. I am able to produce it, create it. That means I have grasped it correctly. The only criteria, therefore, of whether or not you have grasped the thing in itself, you've grasped the objective truth, whether you've achieved the identity of thinking and being, for Marx and Engels, is praxis. Whether or not you are able to, when you put your theory into practice, and yes, the results that you predict are the results that you get, you know that you've understood the thing correctly. Your theory is correct. If you don't get the results you expect, if you're not able to create that, then your theory is wrong. You haven't understood what is going on. You haven't understood the process. So he says, the discoveries of science have already shown us that we can know the thing in itself. And we do. We develop that. And so on. So Kant has been defeated by the development of science, he's saying. Both the materialist and the idealist philosophers were being pushed by the development of natural science and industry in a similar direction. Now, idealists could not ignore, they were also reading the scientists. Materialists were also reading the scientists. And the new scientific discoveries were leading people in a peculiar direction. Hegel, for example, had already incorporated many of the new ideas in natural science into his idea that metaphysics is now out of date. He's the first one really to do this effectively. Whether you're a materialist or whether you're an idealist doesn't matter for Hegel. He's saying, science, look at all the discoveries we've made. We've already proven that nature is not stationary. Although, when he actually spoke about nature, he was not so well informed. He may have made a lot of mistakes in his examination of history, etc. But his fundamental principle was correct, that all of these things, philosophy, history, our understanding, nature, all of these things have a history, are in the process of development, of evolution. Feuerbach is finally driven to the realization that the Hegelian pre-mundane existence of the absolute idea, the pre-existence of the logical categories before the world existed, is nothing more than the fantastic survival of the belief in the existence of an extra-mundane creator. That the material, sensuously perceptible world to which we ourselves belong is the only reality, and that our consciousness and thinking, however supersensuous they may seem, are the product of a material bodily organ, the brain. So Feuerbach then overturns Hegel and says, Mr. Hegel, you have created this whole idea of the idea sitting outside of really existing human beings. In fact, the only thing that exists are really existing human beings who are thinking about their own existence. So Feuerbach comes back now to materialism. He has to overthrow that last remnant of idealism. Matter is not a product of mind, but mind itself is merely the highest product of matter. This was the conclusion of Feuerbach. Mind does not exist independent of matter from eternity, in the form of the spirit, the Geist, etc. But rather, it is an abstraction that Hegel has derived actually by looking at real history, just as Marx talked about the idea of the fruit being extracted from all the different kinds of fruit that exist. In the same way, Hegel has come up with his idea of Geist by extracting from all the different kinds of societies, but he's placed it outside of history, existing from all eternity. That's not correct. Only the science of mechanics at this time had really properly developed fully. Chemistry was very poorly developed, other things were very poorly developed. But because of astronomy, mechanics was highly developed. Motion of bodies at this time was a highly developed science. The application of the standards of mechanics to processes of a chemical and organic nature actually created the first French materialists. They took the ideas in science and then generalized them over philosophy. What were the main ideas? Those were mechanical ideas, mechanics, and they applied them to humanity. And that's why they came to the conclusion that just as the solar system is like a gigantic machine that operates in accordance with a mechanical principle, so too am I, the human being, basically a machine that operates in accordance with mechanical principles. But of course, a human being is not a mechanism. It's a chemical, organic thing. And organic scientific ideas about how organisms function and how chemistry functions were very underdeveloped at that time. So the only thing they could come up with at this particular point in time was that man is a machine. And so their conception of nature was also rather mechanical and therefore also very metaphysical. Nature was considered by them to be immutable, unchanging. Nature was unhistorical. Even Hegel made some of these same mistakes. In fact, even when they looked at history, they looked at it as a mechanical process and as a fixed sort of unhistorical process. History itself was unhistorical. The Middle Ages, they regarded the mechanistic materialists of the French Enlightenment were regarded as mere Middle Ages, the Dark Ages were regarded as mere interruption of history by 1,000 years of superstition and barbarism and ignorance. They failed to see that the whole period of the church, what was called the Middle Ages, also had very important vital developments in that entire period of history. They just discounted the entire period because they were so against the church that they could not see anything positive in that entire period where over Europe, Christianity was hegemonic and dominant, which is wrong. And now, by the way, Engels writes this as 150 years ago. Now, by the way, so many historians have done so much work on looking at the Dark Ages and saying, well, the Dark Ages were not really as dark as depicted by the Enlightenment intellectuals. At this time now, new discoveries come about. Three big new discoveries. The discovery of the cell. Before this period in history, before Robert Hooke, people didn't know that all life has the same building blocks, the cell. He took Galileo's lenses and made a decent microscope out of it. Others had also done that. He made a very good microscope. He developed it further. And then when he turned it on human tissue and animal tissue and other things, he discovered that at the foundation of all organic life was the same thing, the cell. He was the one who named it the cell. The transformation of energy was discovered, how one form of energy can be changed into another form of energy, electricity into magnetism and vice versa, electricity into heat and light and so on. And finally, Darwin's theory of evolution, which had convinced people that nature also had a history. It was not metaphysical. These three main discoveries challenged this metaphysical view of life. But overall, the worldview of philosophy still had not changed. It was too early to establish the interrelation of these discoveries to a bigger picture, to a philosophical worldview. Feuerbach was too isolated in his village. He had the capacity, he says. He was so radical for his time that society rejected him. He couldn't get a job, etc. He moved back to his village. He had a little business, his wife's business. He ran that business for a while, then wo thap ho gaya, and then poor guy had no money. Okay, that's what happens to philosophers, I have to tell you. Same thing happened to Karl Marx. Too far ahead of your time, society doesn't like you very much. Anyway, he could have done it, says Engels. He had the mind for it, but he was too isolated to know all of these changes and so on that were happening at that time. He was too stuck in looking at just that particular framework that he had created and further developing it. Now, many people distort what is meant by idealism. Idealism does not mean belief in ideals. It's totally wrong, he says. This view exists only in the uneducated German Philistines. If you're uneducated, you think, oh, Taimur Rahman is a very idealistic young man. You say that, right? So you say, from that you can say, Taimur is an idealist. But that's not what we mean in philosophy when we use the term idealism, okay? Naturally, of course, everything that sets men acting must find its way through your brain. You think about everything that you act on, that's given. But if we think that this is the definition of idealism, then materialism cannot even conceptually exist. No one can act without thinking. So if you say, okay, no, thoughts are what create action. Obviously, bhai, but where do those thoughts come from? And are those thoughts independent of matter? And is there a thought that existed from all eternity that predated matter? If you look at the question in this particular way, then you're an idealist. But if you look at the question in this way, that your thoughts are the result of your environment, and the environment, the society, the social relations in which you're born, and that society is the result of a historical process of the development of productive forces which has created an economic system within which you are placed in a certain position, in slums or whatever, then you have a materialist understanding of the world. Idealism is not the belief in the inevitable progress of humanity. That's also the wrong definition. Okay? The materialists like Diderot, etc., were also committed to the idea that humanity will progress. So all these three ideas, 1, 2, 3, about idealism are just people who are uneducated who say these things. They don't know what it means. And the real reason why people say these things about idealism and materialism, they often say about materialism, the propaganda of the priests actually equated materialism with gluttony, drunkenness, lust of the eye, lust of the flesh, arrogance, cupidity, avarice, covetousness, profit hunting, stock exchange, swindling. Yani whenever you encounter this definition of materialism and you say, oh, materialism means that you are really in love with material things. It's totally a wrong definition. Philosophically, that's not what it means at all. This was just the propaganda of the church against materialism. That's not what the philosophers mean. So the propaganda of the priests equated idealism with belief in virtue, universal philanthropy, and in the general better way of life, and equated materialism with acquisition of material things. But a materialist philosopher could also be somebody who doesn't care about the acquisition of material things at all, as was the case with poor Karl Marx, who died in penury, as you know. And similarly, an idealistic philosopher may be very materially covetous, despite being epistemologically idealistic. So the two things have nothing to do with each other. What it really means is, what idealism and materialism really mean is, those who believe that ideas exist independent of matter, have existed before matter, or the idea, one idea or many ideas or whatever, but that ideas have an existence independent of the material world, are idealists. And those who believe that ideas are themselves the result of material organic organisms, thinking organisms made of matter, they are the materialists. By the way, you can also have thinking things that are not made of organic substances. Now, you can, in the future, you may have thinking things that are made of metal and silicon and so on, rather than organic substances. I'm made of carbon-based substances. This is made of silicon-based substances. Yet, is it possible that this thing could evolve in the future because of whatever we are doing to it, could evolve to become a thinking thing, a thing that is able to examine the world and think about the world and come up with new conclusions and ideas and so on? Is that possible? It is within the realm of possibility. You're shaking your head, but you must admit that yes, it is possible, maybe not impossible, but maybe improbable, right? So that's it for today. That's the distinction between idealism and materialism.